Afternoon to all of you. It is so good to see all of you this afternoon, and I'm really pumped up after getting that song from Howard. And I actually think it fulfills the challenge and charge that Elizabeth shared with us to really develop the messaging and that elevator speech. I think I'm going to take it, Howard, and figure out how to make a hip-hop track to it, right? That is really our charge and our challenge, to think through, strategize how to take these very important issues and concepts and to make them accessible to the average person on the streets. My name is Delman Coates. I'm the senior pastor of Mount Ennon Baptist Church in Clinton, Maryland. It is a small church of about 9,000 folks right outside of the nation's capital. I have been blessed and privileged to serve there as a senior pastor for going on 12 years now. And we have grown from 1,000 to 9,000 individuals over the course of my tenure there because of our commitment to connect our faith with issues of social justice and public engagement. I'm really honored to be with you today, and certainly want to thank the American Monetary Institute, to thank Stephen Zarlinga for this coveted invitation. It has been on my calendar for quite some time, and I have looked forward to being with you. And I do so with some trepidation. I am certainly, after listening to Professor Huber earlier, I say, oh wow, I'm certainly not qualified to be in this conversation, and you'll probably wonder as well why Stephen invited me to come when I leave. Jamie, thank you so much for the invitation, and certainly I want to acknowledge Joe Bongiovanni, who has counseled, instructed me over the past, I guess a few years or so, since I have become a monetary reformer. I want to call this talk today The New Abolitionism: Monetary Reform and the Struggle for Human Rights. And I want to sort of share at the outset, why have I selected this title, The New Abolitionism? Because all of us who know something about monetary reform, we know that the struggle against the private issuance of money and the bondage it imposes on the populace is not a new struggle. This is not a new issue. So why use this term, the new abolitionism? Well, I use this term for branding or marketing purposes in my yet to be realized attempt to popularize the issue of monetary reform among civil rights and faith leaders, primarily African American civil rights leaders and African American faith leaders, for whom I have deep networks and relationships with across the country. And so the key strategy for opposing monetary reform, I have found, Greg, another strategy. I don't know if we're on the 12th or the 13th strategy for opposing monetary reform, is to change the subject. And so as a nation, after the global financial crisis, many of you will remember in 2008, 2009, the Occupy movement really had the nation, in my mind, looking in the right direction. But now we have focused in recent years as a nation on race relations and police shootings now, issues that we all deeply care about and know are legitimate, real issues. But there are not more police shootings now, just more coverage. I've been wondering, how did we get from this sort of focus on Occupy after the global financial crisis to now this issue with race relations and police shootings? And I say this, the Washington Post recently came out with a story saying that there is a slight increase, but there's some methodological issues there. So how do we get to this? And I want to suggest that perhaps it's in part a changing of the narrative, a changing of the subject by those, the money power, who could sense that the country, perhaps even the world, is moving toward focusing more and more on this very important topic. It's even interesting that even within the civil rights community, I use this term new abolitionism because in the African American community, civil rights community, we have been focused on mass incarceration the last few years and the issues of mass incarceration. And now there is this focus on police reform. Why is that? Certainly we know the corporate implications and profiteering that comes from mass incarceration, and now there is a changing of the narrative, a changing of the subject. So I use the new abolitionism as a rhetorical trope. The troping off of Michelle Alexander's very powerful usage of the term the new Jim Crow, to talk about mass incarceration as a continuation of a prior legacy of systemic oppression in this country. If you have not read her book, I want to encourage you to do so. But her usage of this term, the new Jim Crow, has really been very effective in helping many in the African American community imagine and reimagine the conditions under which we serve today as continuing to be a part of this prior legacy. And so since abolition of chattel slavery in the United States has a long established legacy in this country, one that served as a unifying meta-narrative for those concerned about justice, fairness, morality, and our democracy, I've been thinking about the new abolitionism, right, for conceptual currency and using it for heuristic purposes to connect those in the social justice community, in the community that I serve, and allies across racial, religious, and political boundaries to focus on an issue, money reform, that can unite all of us. Tolstoy said, "Money is a new form of slavery, and distinguishable from the old simply by the fact that it is impersonal, that there is no human relation between master and slave." I want to come back to this notion of the need for a unifying meta-narrative as a means towards creating a broader popular appeal for money reformers. Now I want to begin my talk by sharing with you my journey. Since we were talking about journey earlier, I want to share with you my journey towards becoming a monetary reformer. I'm not an economist. I'm not a historian or a political scientist. I'm a black preacher. I pastor a large African American Baptist church outside of the nation's capital, and I'm deeply steeped and rooted in the black church tradition of social justice, a tradition whose ideals are articulated in the black church's most notable leader, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. says this on one occasion. King said, "Any religion that professes to be concerned about the souls of men and is not concerned about the slums that damn them, the economic conditions that strangle them, and the social conditions that cripple them is a spiritually dead religion waiting burial." The pursuit of the beloved community for all people through the promotion of equality, fairness, and the proportionate distribution of material resources by confronting unjust systems, governments, policies, practices, and power relationships is at the heart of this witness and struggle. The success of America's pluralistic democracy can be significantly advanced through the reintegration of religious progressives in American public life. African American clergy and churches who represent the black church, a historical construct rooted in the legacy of social justice activism, Christian love, and equality, have been and continue to be vital forces for civic engagement, inclusion, economic justice, and social transformation. They are also connected with the historic traditions, religious traditions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam that have had a historic critique and position against usury, which is not just about excessive interest, but the idea that money should not make money. My commitment to monetary reform as a clergy person committed to social justice is that this issue, monetary reform, is the #1 human and civil rights issue of our day, in my estimation. that became very clear for me. I would say around 2009. In 2009, my work then largely as a pastor was focused on addressing the foreclosure crisis, Jim, which was plaguing the community and the county in which I pastor. I pastor in Prince George's County, Maryland, right outside of the nation's capital, a predominantly African-American county, a county that over the recent decades has boasted having the highest educated population of African-Americans in the country and the highest income earning population of African-Americans in the country. And yet, the state of Maryland had the second highest foreclosure rate in the country, and our county had the highest number of foreclosures in the country. And so in the course of working with people in my community, 100 families a week being foreclosed upon, I was drawn into trying to understand what have been the mechanisms that cause these individuals to be put out of their homes. Is it simply just because they were gullible enough to take out mortgages, as the bankers would tell me, that they could not afford? Well, in the course of my ministry and outreach and my effort to get justice for these families, I discovered the complete immoral practice of mortgage and foreclosure fraud that was at the foundation of our global financial crisis. And I wanted to understand, why is it that the same criminals that got us in this mess were becoming richer while the rest of America was getting poorer? Why is it that bankers were staying in their houses, but members of my community and my congregation were being put out of theirs? Why were we being put out while bankers were being bailed out? And their practices have resulted in the largest transfer of wealth in American history, the largest loss and transfer of wealth in history. Think about the insanity of what was happening and continues to happen with the money system. I became a money reformer. The beginning of my journey came with trying to wrestle with how it is the case that banks can securitize notes on one side, then insure those notes on the other side, and then when homeowners failed or defaulted, and the banks did want homeowners to default, they made the taxpayer bail them out. So they privatized profits and then socialized the risk. At that point, I thought that the solution to our economic justice problems were simply to be found in financial regulations. That all we needed to do is to have an economically just society is to rein in the banks. And while these reforms are necessary and appealing, in and of themselves, financial regulations are not enough, because they are built on the premise that the global financial crisis happened because of the absence of cops on Wall Street. But what if the crisis happened not because of a lack of policing on the street, but because there was something fundamentally wrong with the street itself? That there was something wrong with the street itself, and not just that there were insufficient cops on Wall Street, came into view for me when I discovered that when homeowners are giving mortgages, the banks oftentimes never actually loan them money. That there was no consideration in the securitization of promissory notes, and due to tricky accounting, what happens is that banks were able to sell these notes because the notes are assets to the banks and not liabilities. That's when the light went off for me, because I was reminded of a quote from Dr. King, who was himself quoting Victor Hugo, where King said, "If a soul lives in darkness, sins will be committed. But the guilty one is not the one who commits the sins, but the one who causes the darkness." What King was laying out for us is a paradigm on how it is that we can fight injustice in the world today. And the only way to do that is to understand the archaeology, or the origins, or the root cause of the problem. As long as we are addressing symptoms, if we leave the root cause in place, we are merely spinning our wheels. So the struggle for civil rights today must advance beyond addressing symptoms. I have used this example in many contexts in my work with faith and civil rights leaders, that imagine we are all in a room and let's say the water faucet is turned on and water is overflowing on the floor. And let's say we are charged and challenged with cleaning up the water. Well, if we just take a mop and a bucket and start mopping up the water, we will never address the problem. We will never sufficiently address the problem until we what? Turn off the faucet first. So much of our work that I find well-intentioned work is merely mopping up the floor. Monetary reform, in my mind, helps us to first turn off the faucet. King's last speech. King's last speech. Many of us know the speech that he delivered on April the 3rd, 1968 at the Mason Temple Church. Well, many people, when they reflect upon that speech, remember the mountaintop portion of the speech. But few remember the critique of banks. And I would say, by implication, the money power, which is implied in the middle portion of the speech. King told the audience that day in Memphis, remember he is there in Memphis fighting on behalf of sanitation workers, and King says, quote, "And also in the human rights revolution, if something isn't done and done in a hurry to bring the colored peoples of the world out of their long years of poverty, their long years of hurt and neglect, the whole world is doomed. It's all right to talk about streets flowing with milk and honey, but God has commanded us to be concerned about the slums down here and his children who cannot eat 3 square meals a day. Now the other thing we'll have to do is this," King said, "always anchor our external direct action with the power of economic withdrawal. I call upon you to take your money out of the banks downtown and deposit your money in Tri-State Bank. We want a bank-in movement here in Memphis. We begin the process of building a greater economic base," unquote. Economic justice, I believe, is the unfinished civil rights and human rights work of Dr. King. And while we do not know the full extent of his evolving thoughts on economic justice, because his life was taken away from him much too soon, nonetheless, his concern about the economic realities in this country reflect an effort on King's part to focus not on the symptomatic causes we so often focus upon, on what King would call derivative injustice, but on the causes of injustice. King said, quote, "What good is it to have the right to sit at a lunch counter if we cannot afford to buy the hamburger?" Unquote. King understood that money and economics were the cause of the injustice we see in the world today. With all of the necessary issues that perhaps can be and should be a part of an evolving comprehensive campaign today, issues like campaign finance reform, getting money out of politics, ending Citizens United, protecting voter rights, and banking reform. I believe that King's evolving thinking around economics and money would have caused him to oppose our current monetary system in which money is issued by private banks as a debt. We need a public money system today where the benefit of money issuance goes to the people who work hard in this country, and that the benefit of money goes towards public infrastructure, roads, schools, environment, jobs, rather than the benefit of money issuance going to the top 1% of 1%. And I believe we can do it today. We are honored to have with us today Congressman Dennis Kucinich, who's had the courage to push forward the NEED Act. Thank you so much, Congressman, and it's an honor to see you here today. We can do it. We can do it. Our future demands it. Our future requires it. In the 21st century, we are confronted by a myriad of social problems. The American way of life and the ability for people to thrive is being compromised by unemployment, underfunded public schools, crumbling community infrastructure like roads and bridges, cuts to social programs, unaffordable housing, lack of investments to protect the environment, state budgets dwindling, and the mass incarceration of individuals for crimes associated with poverty. And while taxes and the cost of living continue to rise, we are constantly told by elected officials that there is insufficient money available to fund the needs of our society. While the country continues to be shackled by debt, stagnation, budgetary shortfalls, the financial industry has emerged from the recent global financial crisis bigger and wealthier than it was before the crisis. That the industry that caused the greatest financial collapse since the Great Depression is now larger than it was before the crisis ought to cause the American people to focus their attention on the relationship between our money system, banking, and the range of social and economic issues that plague our nation today. And I believe that rather than remaining divided over a range of political causes and agendas that are symptoms of our monetary system, it is much more constructive for citizens, politicians, advocates, and activists to focus our collective efforts on understanding and correcting the root cause of economic injustice and social disparities in America. At its core, our monetary system appears to be the foundational systemic reality that produces much of the poverty and inequality and injustice in our society. So what I have been doing as a part of this campaign is I am beginning to work on socializing these ideas among African American clergy and civil rights leaders. With my church and an organization that I recently founded called the Black Church Center for Justice and Equality, which is intended to be a public policy think tank for progressive black churches, I am working on what I'm calling a campaign for a just economy that contends that our debt-based money system is what causes the social unrest and economic discord in our society, and that if we seek to address the range of social and economic issues confronting our nation, we must fix this foundational structural mechanism of our monetary system. Keeping the public divided along racial, religious, ideological, and partisan lines does nothing but serve the interests of the money power by distracting the American people from the underlying causes of social and economic despair. Monetary reform provides a critical, unifying meta-narrative for those concerned about addressing injustice and expanding American prosperity beyond the financial elite. And my concern is that monetary reform not become ghettoized among the range of other movements today. We cannot have monetary reform just be another ideological option, but that we must figure out a way to connect monetary reform to those who are concerned about environmental justice, to those who are concerned about mass incarceration and criminal justice reform, to those who are concerned about LGBT rights and education and the range of other issues. Reforms, we need to think about how we can create a movement and so to prevent this kind of ghetto we need to think about developing constituencies like environmentalists for monetary reform, criminal justice reformers for monetary reform, Black Lives Matter activists for monetary reform, right? So that monetary reform is just not just another side issue, peripheral issue. Because reforms that leave the current debt-based money mechanism in place will not change the underlying structural features of our money system. Let me skip through some points here. To do this, I want to work towards reclaiming the the theology of economics that has been at the basis of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. The theological basis for seeking a just money system is rooted in the scriptural imperative of the major religions of the world to seek justice, to do mercy, that is found in many scriptural traditions, the biblical mandate to care for the poor and the oppressed, and the scriptural critique of economic injustice, usury, and the oppression of debt. A theology of economics was so central to the central figures of many of our faith traditions, like for me, Jesus, that he began his public ministry by drawing on the prophet Isaiah, declaring that his witness was about liberating the poor and setting at liberty those who are bruised. I believe it's at the foundation of his practice of overturning the tables of the money changers in the temple. And so the ideals of this effort, which are in compatibility and sympathy with the work of the American Monetary Institute, are informed by this theological critique of immoral money that is so central to the Judeo-Christian witness and to the Islamic tradition with this Arabic principle of riba. What is needed then? I want to suggest, as I'm titling this talk today, an economic abolitionist movement, one that seeks to free the American people from the bondage of money created by debt. We believe that to radically shift social priorities in this country, we must tackle the question of monetary reform. And to do this, we must create a popular, mainstream public discourse about the negative financial and societal impacts of debt-based money. We have to create we have to popularize these messages. And I believe that we can do so in a bipartisan manner that seeks to unite the traditional ideological divides between conservatives and liberals, Republicans and Democrat, business and labor, rich and poor, and seeks to build bridges across the distinctives of race, class, gender, religion, sexual orientation to really push for a just economy and a just society. Injustice today is perpetuated by lack of knowledge about the money system. I have met with many of the country's leading politicians, congressmen, senators, and I am amazed, Congressman Kucinich, how none of them understand the money mechanism or how money comes into existence. We've got to correct that. And so messaging is important, as we heard earlier from Elizabeth. I've been saying things like, my elevator speech, Elizabeth, is, we can't have a just society without a just money system. I say that on the elevator. I use phrases like, we need money for all rather than money for some. I develop conceptual metaphors to to help people conceptualize the inherent problem of a money system. Because if banks issue the principal, not the interest, this means that we are in competition for scarce or insufficient resources. I shared with the group last night. So the metaphor that I use is that of musical chairs. I just used it again last week in my Bible study. But I said, hey, how many of you grew up playing musical chairs? Everyone raised their hand. How many of you enjoyed playing musical chairs? Oh, they really enjoy walking around the table, finding a chair when the music stops. I say, you know what? Musical chairs is fun until there's not a chair for you. We have an economy where there are not enough economic chairs for the people in the game. Now, I know those of you who are much more sophisticated about money system than you would point out perhaps the areas or the problems of this metaphor. But the goal here is to really develop conceptual framing and tools for the average person on the street. This is why certain political candidates are being so popular today, because they have figured out how to master language for the average fourth grader. Secondly, I believe we need to start where the Need Act ends. Start where the Need Act ends. I have found that I have lost people because I have started my appeal with help helping people to try to understand the nature, history, and philosophy of money. You know, I've gotten Stephen's great 700-page book table, and I help people understand the nature, history, and philosophy of money, right? And then I go to the second point, helping people to understand, you know, the need to bring the Fed underneath the Treasury. Well, by the time I get to the third aspect of the Need Act, I've lost them. Okay? So, I think if we want to be effective and successful, and taking this wonderful work that's been done with the Need Act, and I know this a bit having run for lieutenant governor in our state, we've got to start with where the Need Act ends. The Need Act ends with the bread and butter issues that people face today. You know, jobs, the environment, roads, people who want taxes reduced and lowered. So I suggest that we start appealing to where the Need Act ends. Next, we have to figure out how to expand the movable middle. I've been a leader in Maryland over the past several years in getting marriage equality passed in the state of Maryland. And the way we were successful and effective in a state where a third of the voting population is African American, a large percentage in the faith community, where no one thought marriage equality would pass at the ballot box in a state with this percentage of African Americans, is we had to expand the movable middle. When you expand the movable middle, you are expanding the coalition of people who are willing to be in conversation with you, even if they are not right now fully understanding or embracing your full objectives at the beginning. So I want to suggest that we really think through how to expand the movable middle with well-intentioned people in the fight for equality and justice who may have different results, different conclusions, without compromising our convictions and our goals, of course, but remaining in conversation with people. I know this is a controversial issue, but I throw it out anyway. Okay. So, the last thing I'm doing, this is the last thing. I'm working on and thinking about a campaign rooted in the civil rights tradition of protest to dramatize the problem that I think monetary reform is attempting to get at. Many people think Dr. King, you know, one of the things that really moved the civil rights movement is when the world saw people being hosed with water, right? The civil rights movement really leveraged media and television. And when people saw those images, right, of people being hosed with water, really helped the movement. So since my journey begins with my deep passion for people being kicked out of their homes in an immoral way, I have really been working and thinking about taking families who have lost their homes and being put out of their homes and taking them down to the local courthouses where judges are rubber stamping these foreclosures and holding sit-ins in courthouses around the country to dramatize this notion that at the core of this injustice that is happening in our community and in my community is the way in which our money system is based on very problematic assumptions. I want to thank you for listening to me here today. My apologies for going so long here, but that's my talk. I'm really honored to answer any questions and look forward to partnering with all of you.